There are moments in life when you lose more than just a person. You lose a part of yourself that you can never get back. On March 21, 1987, Dean Martin's youngest son, Dino Jr., died in a fighter jet crash in Arizona. He was only 35 years old. But the real tragedy didn't happen at the moment of the crash. It happened 3 days later, at Dino Jr.'s funeral. That's where Dean Martin, the king of cool, finally broke. That's where America watched the most legendary entertainer of his generation completely fall apart. He didn't cry quietly. He didn't hold it together. He didn't perform through his pain. Instead, he stood at his son's grave and showed the world something it had never seen before. A father so devastated by loss that he couldn't even speak his goodbye. What happened that day changed how an entire nation understood grief. It shattered the myth that strength means never breaking. And it proved that sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is admit that your heart is shattered beyond repair. If you've ever wondered how to survive the unthinkable, if you've questioned whether it's okay to fall apart, this story will change everything you believe about grief and strength. Like and subscribe so you never miss stories about the human heart at its most vulnerable, the man and his legend. Dean Martin was born in 1917 in Steubenville, Ohio. By the time he reached middle age, he'd become one of the most successful entertainers in the world. His voice was legendary. His movies were blockbusters. His television show was a cultural institution. He performed in Las Vegas to thousands of adoring fans. Dean Martin had everything. Money, fame, respect, admiration. The world loved him. But success came at a cost. Dean had built an empire based on being charming, funny, and in control. He was the guy you wanted at your party. He was the guy who could make anyone laugh. He was the guy who never seemed to struggle with anything. It was a carefully constructed image. Behind closed doors, Dean was different. He was a father who loved his children deeply. He was a man who worried about his kids. He was someone who felt things intensely but kept those feelings hidden from the world. The son who made him proud. Dino Jr. was Dean's youngest child from his second marriage to Jeannie Beager. When Dino Jr. was born, Dean was already in his 40s. He was already a legend. So when his youngest son came along, Dean made a silent promise. This boy would be raised differently. This boy would have a father who was present. Dino Jr. grew up watching his father perform. He saw the applause. He saw the fame. He saw the success. But Dino Jr. didn't want to follow in his father's footsteps in the entertainment industry. Instead, he chose a different path. At 18 years old, Dino Jr. joined the United States Air Force. He wanted to be a pilot. He wanted to serve his country. He wanted to build his own identity, separate from being Dean Martin's son. Dean supported this decision, even though it meant his son would be away. Even though it meant his son would be in danger. Even though it meant his son would be pursuing a career that Dean could never fully understand. But that's what love means. Love means supporting your child's dreams, even when those dreams take them away from you. Love means being proud of them for being themselves. Dino Jr. became a fighter pilot. He was good at it, excellent, in fact. He had the skills, the dedication, and the courage that the Air Force demanded. Dean would attend his son's graduation ceremonies. He would listen to Dino Jr. talk about his missions. He was immensely proud. A father's hidden fear. Despite his public image of cool invincibility, Dean Martin had one terrible fear. That something would happen to his children. He had other kids from previous relationships, and he loved them all. But Dino Jr. was special. Dino Jr. was the child he'd been most present for. The child he'd watched grow from a baby to a man. Friends noticed that Dean would worry when Dino Jr. was flying. He'd ask about the missions. He'd ask if his son was being careful. He'd try to hide his concern behind jokes and casual conversation. But people who knew him well could see the fear underneath. Dean never wanted to be overprotective. He didn't want to hold his son back from pursuing his dreams. So he kept his fears to himself. He supported Dino Jr.'s career. He was proud when his son was promoted. He encouraged Dino Jr. to be the best pilot he could be. But inside, in that place where Dean kept his real feelings, he was terrified. He was terrified of losing his youngest son. The day the fear became reality. On March 21, 1987, Dino Jr. was flying an F-15 Eagle fighter jet during a routine training mission near Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. He was an experienced pilot. He was careful. He was doing everything right. But somewhere over the desert, something went catastrophically wrong. The jet crashed. Dino Jr. died on impact. The notification came to Dean Martin like a lightning bolt, Sudden, devastating, life-shattering. His youngest son. His baby. The child he'd watched grow up. The young man he was so proud of. Gone. Dean's world stopped. The man who'd spent his entire adult life entertaining people, making them laugh, keeping them entertained. That man suddenly found that none of it mattered. None of the success. None of the fame. None of the achievements. His son was dead, and no amount of talent or charm or money could change that. For the first time in his life, Dean Martin understood that there are some things in the world that are stronger than him. Some things that no performance can fix. Some things that break you permanently. The days between. In the days between learning about Dino Jr.'s death and the funeral, Dean Martin was lost. Completely, utterly lost. He didn't eat. He barely slept. He walked around his house like a ghost, unable to believe that his son was really gone. Unable to understand that he would never hear Dino Jr.'s voice again. Unable to accept that a 35-year-old man with his whole life ahead of him was now in a casket. His ex-wife, Jeannie, was also grieving. She came to be with Dean. They sat together, two people who had loved the same child, now mourning that child together. There was no anger between them. There was only shared devastation. Dean's other children came. His friends tried to comfort him. But nothing helped. Nothing made sense. There was no explanation. There was no reason. There was only the brutal, terrible fact. Dino Jr. was dead. People urged Dean to stay strong. They told him to think of his other children. They told him that Dino Jr. would want him to keep going. They tried to comfort him with platitudes and empty words. But Dean didn't want to be comforted. Dean didn't want to be strong. Dean wanted his son back. The weight of unfinished business. As Dean sat alone in his house, he thought about all the things he would never get to do with his son. He thought about conversations they would never have. He thought about grandsons he would never hold. He thought about watching Dino Jr. grow old, which he would now never do. He thought about the last time he'd seen his son. He tried to remember if he'd told him that he loved him. He tried to remember if he'd been fully present in that moment or if he'd been distracted by something else. This is the special torture of loss. The question that haunts you forever. Did I do enough? Did I say enough? Did I show my love enough? Dean had been a present father compared to many men of his generation. But he hadn't been perfect. He was busy. He was successful. He was focused on his career. There were probably times when he wasn't fully present for his son. There were probably words he could have said but didn't. There were probably hugs that didn't happen. Now, none of those moments could ever be recovered. Dino Jr. would never know if his father had regretted those missed moments. Dino Jr. would never hear his father say, "I wish I'd been more present. I wish I'd spent more time with you." The guilt was consuming. The grief was overwhelming. Dean Martin, the king of cool, was drowning. The day of the funeral. March 24th, 1987. 3 days after his son's death, Dean Martin had to bury him. The funeral was held at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood. Hundreds of people came. Hollywood celebrities, politicians, military personnel, friends and family. Everyone came to pay their respects to Dino Jr. and to support Dean Martin. Dean was dressed impeccably. His suit was perfect. His tie was perfect. His hair was perfectly styled. On the outside, he was still the king of cool. But his eyes told the real story. His eyes were hollow. His eyes were dead. His eyes belonged to a man who had lost everything that mattered. He took a seat at the front of the gathering. Nearby sat his other children, his ex-wife, and his close friends. Everyone was trying to be strong. Everyone was trying to hold it together. The service began. The minister spoke about Dino Jr.'s life. He talked about his service to his country. He talked about what a good man he was. He talked about the loss to his family and to the Air Force. Then people started to stand up to speak. Friends of Dino Jr. talked about what he meant to them. Military colleagues talked about his excellence as a pilot. Family members talked about his character. And then it was Dean's turn. The man at the microphone. Dean stood up slowly. The crowd fell silent. Everyone wanted to hear what Dean Martin would say about his son. Everyone wanted to see how the king of cool would handle this moment. Dean walked to the microphone. His steps were heavy, like he was walking through water. His face was gray. His lips were trembling. He reached the microphone and looked out at the crowd. He opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came out. He tried again. Still nothing. People in the crowd were starting to worry. Was Dean okay? Was he having a health crisis? Dean stood there, gripping the microphone stand, trying with all his might to find the words. But there were no words. How do you speak about burying your child? How do you find language for an experience that destroys you from the inside out? After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, Dean finally spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. I don't know how to do this. The crowd could see tears streaming down his face. But Dean wasn't trying to hide them. He wasn't trying to be strong anymore. He was just a father at his son's grave, completely broken. The breakdown. My son. Dean started, then had to stop. He was crying so hard he could barely breathe. My son was. He looked down at the casket. He looked at the wooden box that contained his youngest child. And something inside him shattered completely. Dean Martin put his face in his hands and sobbed. Not quiet, contained sobs. Full-bodied, soul-deep sobs that came from a place of absolute devastation. People in the crowd were crying too. They'd never seen anything like this. They'd never seen the legend break down like this. They'd never seen a man so completely destroyed by grief. This wasn't performance. This wasn't the king of cool being charming and smooth. This was a human being experiencing the worst moment of his life, and he was experiencing it in front of hundreds of people. After what felt like forever, Dean tried to compose himself. He lifted his face from his hands. His face was red. His eyes were swollen. But he kept standing at that microphone. Dino Jr. was the light of my life, he said, his voice shaking so badly that people had to strain to hear him. He was my youngest. He was my pride. He was everything that was good about me, but better. He was braver than me. He was stronger than me. He was a better man than I could ever be. Dean paused, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside. I thought I would have more time, he continued. I thought I would see him grow old. I thought I would meet his children. I thought we would have decades together. But we don't. We won't. He's gone, and I'm here, and that's not fair. That's not how this was supposed to work. The words that changed everything. I've spent my whole life making people laugh, Dean said, his voice now filled with raw emotion. I've spent my whole life entertaining people. I've spent my whole life trying to be this smooth, cool guy who never has a bad day, never shows weakness, never lets you see what's really going on inside. He looked out at the crowd, and his eyes were blazing with pain. But I'm telling you right now, that's all a lie. I'm not smooth. I'm not cool. I'm broken. I'm destroyed. My son is dead, and I can't fix it. I can't sing my way out of it. I can't charm my way out of it. I can't perform my way out of it. His voice dropped so low that people had to hold their breath to hear him. Dino Jr., if you can hear me, I need you to know something. I need you to know that I loved you more than I've ever loved anything in this world. I need you to know that you made me proud every single day. I need you to know that the best thing I ever did in my life was be your father. Dean looked directly at the casket. I'm going to spend the rest of my life missing you, he said quietly. I'm going to spend the rest of my life wishing I had more time with you. I'm going to spend the rest of my life knowing that I should have held you tighter, told you more often how much I loved you, been more present for you. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. But I did love you. I always loved you. And I always will. The silence that followed. Dean stepped back from the microphone. He didn't try to compose himself. He didn't try to smile through the tears. He just walked back to his seat, broken, shattered, destroyed. The cemetery was completely silent. Nobody was moving. Nobody was breathing. The only sound was the wind and the distant sound of Dean's footsteps as he walked back to sit down. His other children reached over to hold him. His ex-wife held his hand. His friends sat nearby, witnessing the complete destruction of a man's heart. The minister finished the service quickly. There wasn't much more to say. Everything that needed to be said had been said by a father standing at his son's grave, finally allowing the world to see that the king of cool was, underneath it all, just a man. A man who loved his son more than life itself. A man whose heart had been buried in that casket along with his child. What we witnessed. What happened at Dino Jr.'s funeral on March 24th, 1987, was a moment of devastating honesty. It was a moment when one of the most famous entertainers in the world chose to let the world see his pain instead of hiding it behind a performance. This moment changed how America understood grief. It changed how people understood the price of fame. It changed how people understood what it means to be a man. For generations, men had been taught to be strong, to not cry, to keep their feelings hidden, to solve their problems through action and willpower. But Dean Martin, standing at his son's grave, proved that sometimes there's nothing you can do. Sometimes You just have to admit that your heart is broken and probably always will be. The king who lost his kingdom. In the months after Dino Jr.'s funeral, Dean Martin was never the same. He continued to perform, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. The joy was gone. The smoothness was gone. He was going through the motions, but there was no heart in it. Friends noticed that he would sometimes break down unexpectedly. They noticed that he didn't joke as much. They noticed that beneath the surface, Dean was still drowning in grief. He'd lost a son. There's no recovering from that. You just learn to live with the pain. You just learn to carry it with you forever. In the years before his death in 1995, Dean Martin rarely talked about Dino Jr. in public. But people who knew him said that he talked about his son constantly in private. He talked about the things Dino Jr. would never experience. He talked about the grandchildren he would never meet. He talked about missing his son every single day. The universal truth. What Dean Martin taught us at his son's funeral is something that our society desperately needs to hear. Grief is not something you overcome. Grief is something you carry. And carrying it means being honest about the weight of it. We live in a culture that tells us to move on from loss. We're supposed to have a funeral, mourn for a while, and then get back to normal. We're supposed to be strong. We're supposed to inspire others with our resilience. But the truth that Dean Martin showed us is that some losses are too big to move on from. Some losses change you permanently. Some losses break you in ways that you never fully repair. And that's okay. That's not weakness. That's not failure. That's being human. The impact that rippled through the years. After Dean Martin's breakdown at his son's funeral, the landscape of grief in America changed slightly. More people started talking openly about their losses. More fathers started telling their sons that they loved them. More people started recognizing that grief deserved to be honored instead of hidden. The footage of Dean Martin crying at his son's grave has been watched by millions of people over the years. And every time someone watches it, they see something true about human nature. They see that even the greatest among us can be destroyed by loss. They see that success and fame don't protect you from heartbreak. They see that the only appropriate response to losing someone you love is to admit that your heart is broken. What Dino Jr. left behind. Dino Jr. died in 1987, but his legacy lived on in his father. Dean Martin carried his son with him every day for the rest of his life. Every performance was, in some way, a tribute to Dino Jr. Every moment of joy was tempered by the knowledge that Dino Jr. would never have that joy. But more than that, Dino Jr. left behind a moment of truth. He left behind a moment when the king of cool finally took off his crown and showed the world that he was just a man. A man who loved his son. A man who was destroyed by that son's death. A man who would never be whole again. That moment at the funeral became a gift to all of us. It gave us permission to be broken. It gave us permission to grieve openly. It gave us permission to be honest about the fact that sometimes life breaks us in ways that we can never fully repair. The father's legacy. When Dean Martin died in 1995, the newspapers talked about his career. They talked about his incredible achievements as an entertainer. They talked about his influence on Hollywood and Las Vegas. But what they should have talked about was the moment at his son's funeral. They should have talked about the fact that Dean Martin, the king of cool, was actually a man who loved deeply and grieved deeply. They should have talked about the courage it took to stand at his son's grave and admit that his heart was shattered. Because that moment is what made Dean Martin truly great. Not his talent, not his success, but his humanity, his vulnerability, his willingness to be broken in front of the world. Fire the final word. On March 24, 1987, Dean Martin buried his heart with Dino Jr. A part of him died that day. The part that believed he could control his life. The part that believed that success could protect him from pain. The part that believed that being strong meant never breaking. What remained was something more real. Something more honest. Something more human. The funeral that broke the king taught us that the greatest strength isn't in never falling apart. The greatest strength is in allowing yourself to fall apart and then somehow finding the will to keep living. Dean Martin did that. He fell apart at his son's grave. And then, every day for the rest of his life, he kept living. He kept performing. He kept loving his family. He kept going. That's the real story. That's the real lesson. That's why, more than 30 years later, we still remember the day that Dean Martin showed the world his broken heart. If this story about a father's devastating loss reminded you that grief is love with nowhere to go, please like and subscribe. Tell your children that you love them today. Don't wait. Don't assume they know. Tell them. Hold them. Be present with them. Because none of us knows how much time we have with the people we love most. And when they're gone, all you'll have left is the memory of whether you told them how much they meant to you. Don't let that memory be filled with regret. Asterisk, asterisk. Dean Martin taught us through his pain that love is worth the price we pay for it. Even when that price is devastating. Even when that price is permanent. Even when that price is burying your heart with someone you love. That's the message we need to hear in a world that tells us to stay strong, stay cool, stay in control. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is break down. Because in that breaking, we become truly, deeply human. Dino Jr. would want us to remember that.